Not again.
How? Again?
Hello, and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. Today we are talking to James Riley about Charles Manson and the end of the 60s. This session was recorded on 11th of August 2020 as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Practice and Research Group's free weekly meetup. We have more on our website, explodingappendix.com, and you can find our meetups in Brighton or online on Zoom. You can find us on SoundCloud, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and Eventbrite. Now James Riley will introduce himself.
So the thing I'm working on at the moment is a book about William Burroughs and his use of the tape recorder to make sound recordings and to help him use it as a writing tool. So that'll be a book, and that looks at all these sort of hidden tapes of William Burroughs. And there's a chapter on how he thought you could use a tape recorder to put curses on people. So it looks at all these sort of little known tapes that he did and how he used it to write his novels, and but moves out to how he saw it as a device for altering reality and doing all kinds of strategic things with.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah. So I'll move on to the first question. So The Bad Trip, I just think it's a really fantastic book. It's almost a bit like a novel, I think, in the sense that you go through this kind of story of all these different things that are happening, and these characters kind of keep re-emerging. And so, of course, it's really sort of weird kind of picture of the 60s and the sort of mythology of the 60s. So I just wanted to ask about how you came to sort of write this book.
Well, thanks for that. And obviously, again, thanks everyone for coming. It's nice to see everyone, and thanks everyone for coming and huddling around their devices and laptops on such a hot day. It's nice to see anyone, and nice to see everyone, and thank you, Bradley, for the invitation. It's very heartening to hear that you thought it was like a novel, because the sort of narrative element of it was something I was trying to bring out. Something that story bring out. What I really wanted to get a sense of was a sort of collection of characters who appear. I do academic writing. The Burroughs book that I was talking about is more of a sort of monography. There's lots of archival research. It's pursuing quite a tight thesis. This book was slightly different. So this is more of a non-fiction type of book, and the sort of publisher took it on that basis. And it was very much intended as a kind of accessible, slightly provocative, hopefully, non-fiction account, which was intended to be published in 2019 to coincide with the 50th anniversary of 1969 and various other events. So it very much had that kind of project in mind, and that's what I was trying to get at. In some ways, quite a specific remit, but in terms of how I came to write it, it emerged out of quite a long-standing interest in the period, a long-standing interest in the 1960s as a historical period, but also the 60s more broadly as an idea. I've always been interested in the period, but I also found myself sort of extensively, I suppose almost from childhood, being more interested in, I suppose, the darker element of the decade. But what I found very fascinating and what I was always really interested in is the way that dark side is not really a kind of alternate side. It's sort of bound into the sort of day glow psychedelia of the 1960s. It's never really far away. And certainly growing up, going through the sort of stereotypical father's record collection and getting to 60s music from that direction, but also listening to things like Sounds of the 60s on Saturday mornings on Radio 2. You'd hear sort of Scott McKenzie and the New Seekers, but they were also immediately be followed by The Crazy World of Arthur Brown and the Stooges and the Doors. And these records that, in terms of a playlist, essentially seem as thematic and tonal juxtapositions, seem to be accommodated seemingly quite easily within what we come to understand as the 1960s. They seem to work within that kind of sequence. So I was always really interested in that kind of interplay between what you might broadly call the light and the dark within the period and how they tie together. I was interested in things like Patrick McGowan's The Prisoner, shows like The Avengers, where you'd have all these strange, abandoned English villages, and there's both the quaint and uncanny at the same time. And soon after that, I had a sort of young encounter with Stanley Booth's book about the Rolling Stones, True Adventures of the Rolling Stones, which is bookended around a very vivid description of the Altamont Festival. And it wasn't long from encountering that to get a sense of the sort of Manson milieu. And so my kind of enthusiasm for and awareness of the 1960s seemed also to tally with an increasing sense of the way in which the end of the decade was often told and spoken about and remembered and represented as this kind of catastrophe in various ways, a sort of decline, a series of events and occurrences and happenings seem to constellate around 1969, which seemed to invert the atmosphere and the tonality and the sentiment of the decade that followed. And it did seem to be a catastrophe very much in the kind of tragic narratological sense, a kind of rapid movement towards some kind of denouement. And this was very interesting to me. But also not just in the sense of there seemed to be some kind of story there. When we think about the end of the 60s in that way, we do tend to talk about certain events which can be dated, which can be documented, which have stories linked to them. But I was also interested in the way, very resonant, very attractive. It seems to be one of the many narratives of the decade that persist the sense that they'll at the end of the decade. What I really wanted to sort of, if you like, trying to consider and to reflect upon what that story might actually be about. What that story might mean, and I suppose this is where we might go into language, but to tell us about the 1960s, because if we do see the decade and its counterculture as something of a project that ends in violence, death, and bad craziness, some of those things are there throughout the decade as a whole. And when we constellate them in memories and remembrances and retellings around the end of the decade, we kind of obscure those other elements that are active and resonant. It seemed to me that whole narrative of the end of the 60s, it's sort of in tension with a broader awareness and something of and an image and a reading of the decade as something of a panorama of these darker elements, this violence, this tumult, this difficulty. So, as I said, I was trying to get to some of the story, but I didn't want to just demystify it. I wanted to reflect on that story as well. I wanted to uncover some of its meanings and what it was actually talking about. So bring those two different sides together, the 60s and the 1960s, and think about what the image of its collapse might actually signify and why it's so sort of popular and why it's so kind of resonant. It seemed to me that it said a lot, not just about some kind of collapse, but it was almost a kind of backhanded way of talking about the presumed exceptionalism of the 1960s. That's to say, what else are we meant to expect of such an apparently sort of supernova of a decade than this spectacular decline in its final days, this almost kind of apocalyptic decline. And I wanted to interrogate that and question it, but as I said, also reflect on it, on its attractiveness. What's the source of its fascination? And all these things were bubbling there. All these things I was very interested in other elements of my academic work. I'd had the opportunity to sort of work quite closely with some of the figures from the period, particularly Peter Whitehead, the filmmaker and novelist who had his own role within this narrative and in some ways contributed towards it. But things really started to crystallize together shortly before beginning the book and shortly before the project actually came together, when I saw some art by the contemporary psychedelic artist Luke Insect, and I think we have an example of that here that Bradley might be able to share with us. This was an exhibition that I attended at a gallery in London, Idea Generation Gallery. I went there via an event that was put together by my friend, the artist and writer Evie Salmon, and we had a look at some of these images. If we go to slide 2, we'll just see some of these images that are produced by Luke Insect, who's a sort of graphic designer and has produced a lot of posters for psychedelic shows, rave art. And the image in the center there, which is a sort of stained glass window, a locked stained glass window. And it's based around an image of Grace Slick from Jefferson Airplane. She's holding a middle finger up to the camera. And this window, this potential portal or conduit to another world, is suffused with all kinds of strange images. It's ostensibly what we might expect of psychedelic art, but there's sort of textual references to cults and conspiracies there. There are sort of snakes and triangles, which we might broadly say is there's some kind of magical imagery. And also, whilst it has the kind of color palette and the visual language that we might associate with psychedelia, which is stereotypically about expanding one's horizons, about opening the mind, about potentially entering another world, this is a kind of a locked door. And with Grace Slick's sort of stance and her gesture there, it's also an image of some kind of refusal, as if to say, this door's locked, you can't get in. And it's got all this sort of seeming negativity or slight sense of unease, but at the same time, it's a very attractive image. And I was thinking about all these ideas and these stories and these figures and these historical events when I saw this image, and this seemed to crystallize things together because there's also a kind of style here. There's also something of an aesthetic There's also something of a kind of a visual language which goes together with this idea of the end of the 60s, which speaks, I think, of its attractiveness and its continued resonance. So this image became a kind of, I suppose, a kind of talisman for the project as a whole. I really wanted to, if you like, get into that image and to get a sense of why it's so kind of attractive and why it remains so attractive, but also that potential dissonance between the sort of invitation of psychedelia and this, I suppose, this code that we might so easily associate with the 1960s, and this sort of contemporary view of it as being sort of refused, denied. We're being told to go away in some ways. There's another piece, again, which crystallized things together for me, which I think is worth sharing. We can just move on to the next slide. This is the original photograph there of Grace Slick. And around this time, I also found and came across a vocally isolated track of White Rabbit. So if we could just play this is just Grace Slick's own vocals singing this song.
One pill makes you larger and one pill makes you small, and the ones that mother gives you don't do anything at all. Go ask Alice when she's 10 feet tall. And if you go chasing rabbits and you know you're going to fall, tell 'em a hookah smoking caterpillar has given you the call. He called Alice when she was just small. When the men on the chessboard get up and tell you where to go, and you've just had some kind of mushroom and your mind is moving low, go ask Alice, I think she'll know. When logic and proportion
I mean, I'm sure you agree. I mean, that's a stunning vocal performance from. It's White Rabbit is this really kind of famous song which seems to sum up Jefferson Airplane, but also that whole period of Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. So it's an incredibly famous song. You're probably very familiar with it. It's got everything that we expect of mid to late 1960s psychedelia, Alice in Wonderland, feeding your head, the invitation to some kind of altered states. Along with Somebody to Love, it's featured almost endlessly in films and documentaries about the 1960s. Perhaps most famously, it appears in Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and also Terry Gilliam's film of that book. So incredibly familiar song, but listening to that track there, it seemed to me to make it massively unfamiliar at the same time. It sounded like a kind of siren call. It really made it incredibly haunting and beguiling. And I guess along with the Luke Insect image, this track became again something of a talisman for doing the book in terms of getting the tone and the sort of atmosphere right, and how I wanted the sort of narrative to flow and what I wanted people to get out of it. And I suppose I was sort of, how would I implicitly soundtrack it if I was doing it as a film or a documentary? And it's that an unfamiliar take on something which is very familiar is what I was trying to get at. And ostensibly, if I was going to sort of summarize the approach of the book as a whole, I wanted it to be a kind of uncanny history of the 1960s and its end.
Yeah, it's a really brilliant song, actually.
Yeah, I love Jefferson Airplane. Love that song. It's awesome. One of the ones on my list that I really wanted. I like to try and cover songs that are really impossible to do, just to push my limits, and that's one of them. But I'm afraid to touch it because it's so good.
Where it's just kind of like such a strong and kind of singular performance, and you just sort of it's great sort of instrumentation on that track. There's some fabulous footage of Jefferson Airplane playing on a kind of, I think it's American Bandstand, and Grace Slick is sort of dressed as a kind of nun figure, and she looks like she's drawn a kind of cult together, and that very, very, very strong and resonant footage. But for me, that track really does reiterate just what a great singer Grace Slick was, and it brings a whole different dimension to the song. And like I said, it became something of the tonality that at a very low level I was trying to get to the telling of this and the style of it.
So maybe I'll just go on to the next question. So in the book, you explore the sort of mythology around figures like Charles Manson. You explore how Manson seems to kind of represent the kind of dark side of the 60s, and you've already sort of mentioned some of those dark sides, or that sort of dark side of the 60s counterculture. So whilst Manson appears absolutely opposed to the spirit of sort of peace and love, there is a sense in which he is kind of emerging out of a similar culture and living in the Haight-Ashbury area and taking influence from people like the Beatles and other countercultural figures. So how should we understand and make sense of this kind of characterization of Charles Manson?
Yeah, that's one of the main things I wanted to get at. And for obvious reasons, Charles Manson is a figure who looms large in the book and the narrative, but equally, looms large in the 60s, the histories of the 60s and its own telling and its remembrance. And what I was interested in and trying to get at was Charles Manson's symbolic role, the way in which in a lot of accounts of the period, as it appears like this kind of anomaly pretty much from nowhere, who appears towards the end of this period and spoils it, as if to say everything is going perfectly fine. And there's it's a wonderful project. The counterculture is promising so much, and then Manson comes along as this kind of alternate and oppositional figure who sort of both represents and also initiates this kind of rapid tragic decline. If you look at people like Maury Terry's book, The Ultimate Evil, the language around Manson, for obvious reasons, seems to take on this very sort of ominous tone, but he himself appears in the narrative as if he's this kind of prophet of doom. It's complicated by the fact that this was also something of an identity and a discourse and a rhetoric that Charles Manson himself was self-consciously playing with at the time. And I think that's what makes it complex and difficult, but also worthy of questioning and bringing together. I always find it difficult talking about Charles Manson because we're also talking about a figure who was essentially involved in all kinds of physical and psychological abuse. And of course, his work and his interaction and his movement through this milieu also ended up with the death of a large number of people, which he was directly and indirectly involved with. So it's sort of a challenging figure in the sense to think about Peeling simply as a symbol, right? To talk about him as what he might signify, because there's a tendency there for that to sort of erase the actual terrible events and terrible acts that he was actually involved with. But I think that there remains something of an involute, if you like, of something of an entanglement between the actuality of this particular figure and the things that he engaged with and things that he did and the kind of terrible coercive behavior that he was engaged with. But there's also, I think, a deeply manipulative and self-conscious awareness of a very particular language that he was able to play on and play with. I don't quite see Charles Manson as a kind of logical extension of the counterculture, but I do see him as someone who actually took advantage of that language and advantage of a lot of those ideas, and was if you like, prescient enough and canny enough to recognize that there was lots of people who was responsive to and, if you like, looking for that kind of language. Because what we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about Charles Manson, and I think this is the approach that I try to take, is not so much kind of demystify, but almost think about Charles Manson in a kind of double sense, that there is Charles Miles Maddox, there's the individual, there's the career criminal, and then there's Charles Manson, which is this name, this image, this symbol, which in some ways exceeds and has lived on past the individual himself. But what we need to keep in mind is that Charles Manson, he is, from the outset, a con man. He appears towards the end of the decade because he gets out of prison on parole in 1967. And by that point, he's a good bit older than the stereotypical hippie. He spent the majority of his time and the majority of his youth in prisons and institutions of one form or another. And he had a stretch of almost 10 years in prison before he arrives in San Francisco in 1967. And he got that stretch for basically violating an earlier set of parole terms and for sex trafficking. He was essentially a pimp in the late 1950s. And he worked in and around Los Angeles and Hollywood in the late 1950s. He started at something called 3 Star Enterprises, which was the sort of stereotypical Hollywood scam. It was the actress agency. He was doing the thing of meeting people off the bus, young, isolated girls, promising them auditions, meetings with producers, etc., and essentially forcing them into prostitution. And what he would do is he would separate these people from their support networks. He would make himself the key central figure in their lives and enforce a kind of dependency, and then he will be able to manipulate them, and then he will then be able to exert control. So 3 Star Enterprises was basically Charles Manson working out of an office on Franklin Avenue in Hollywood, and he had a sort of a group of young women, young girls with him who he had managed to gain influence and control over. Involved in other kinds of petty crime at the time, other forms of parole violation, and that's essentially what leads him to go into jail at the start of the 1960s. Now, when he gets out, he comes to Haight-Ashbury, and he comes to San Francisco, and he sort of realizes what's going on. I mean, Haight-Ashbury is a sort of an automatic destination for someone who's a recent parolee. It's not because he kind of zeroed in on the positive energies out of some kind of pure darkness that he was just attracted to. He went to that area because that was the place where, he knew he could get cheap accommodation. There would be a free legal clinic. He would get support in terms of finding further work. But he was also noticing that there was a kind of an atmosphere of a certain kind of language. There were people occupying, if you like, leader roles, exerting certain elements of influence. There was a high proportion of young people in the area. They were transient. They were out of their support networks. So Manson creating the family and Manson getting this group of people together who were essentially young, isolated women. It was him doing the same thing that he'd done at the end of the 1950s, but rather than talking about meetings with producers and casting agents, he was talking about truth and wisdom and insight, right? He was offering some degree of enlightenment. He was creating a kind of semi-cultish environment. He was offering himself as this kind of spiritual leader. The thing is, it was a sort of an absorption and an adaptation of the predominant language which was circulating in the area that he found himself, and combining that with what he was doing at the start of the 1960s. It's worth also pointing out that while he was in jail, whilst he was in jail for the majority of the 1960s, he came under the usual sort of prison influences of other career criminals, a lot more professionalized criminals at the time. He worked with psychiatrists, so he was able to observe at close quarters the sort of working dynamics of that kind of therapeutic groups. He got very much interested into science fiction, particularly Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein. He gained exposure to what was Dianetics, which obviously became the Church of Scientology. And he sort of learned the kind of auditing methods from a friend and colleague who he was in prison with. And he also saw the Beatles perform on the Ed Sullivan Show. So whilst he had this time in prison, he was exposed to these influences, which were messianic in some way, which were the tools and the techniques for gaining influence, the tools and the techniques of coercive control, which ostensibly didn't require physical violence. So when he gets out into Haight-Ashbury and he sees what, from his perspective, a kind of vulnerable demographic in front of him, he's able to manipulate this, and he's able to work this group to his advantage. So, it's someone who is deeply abusive, who's deeply exploitative. He remains throughout an opportunistic conman. And I suppose that's what we've kind of got to keep in mind when we're talking about Charles Manson. Terrible things happen under his control, but at the same time, kind of apocalyptic fantasy that he kind of spreads and talks about, the kind of HELTER SKELTER project, is also part of that group mentality that he's trying to keep together. That his power relies upon keeping a small, tight group relatively isolated from others and offering them something, offering some kind of goal, offering some kind of reward. If you stick with me, if you are loyal to me, I will offer you the kingdom, the world will be ours. And with that kind of language, as you know, the sort of history of cults and other religious groups indicates, that there always comes a sort of tipping point. There always comes a kind of internal crisis point where something that you either engage with the great disappointment or something is offered. And as one way of looking at the kind of inauguration of the Helter Skelter project, if you want to call it that, the Tate LaBianca murders, is him moving through that kind of crisis. He beginning to sort of believe his own cover story, as William Burroughs would put it. I suppose my take on Charles Manson was to be, if you like, interrogate and in some ways kind of deconstruct this myth, but at the same time not to fully demythologize it, because what makes Charles Manson is someone who is very active in myth making. He's a strategic myth maker. So I was wanting to actually bring out the mechanisms of that self-conscious mythography in my sort of narrative of this character.
Was he mentally ill, and was he ever diagnosed? I presume he was diagnosed as something.
When he was in prison, before he came to Haight-Ashbury, he was diagnosed with depression. And that's why he was put with a psychiatrist in prison. You know, it's easy to see that once the sort of family project gets under the way, that there's an enormous amounts of paranoia, there's enormous amounts of a kind of persecution complex, which is reiterating that. And that's certainly things that come out in the trial. That's certainly the opinion of Vincent Bugliosi, the lead prosecutor. I think I'm not massively convinced as to the diagnosis of him suffering from depression in the prison context, because I think that he was sort of wanting access to certain things. I think my assessment of him reading through his prison period and the available sources is, I think that he was interested to see the way in which a psychiatrist would actually work and to operate. So I don't doubt that there were psychological difficulties and serious mental health issues, but I also think that he's able to think through those and, if you like, utilize them to a certain degree.
But there's also the thing of, I think it's a psychopath. Is it a sociopath? I think it's a psychopath, and they're able to sort of charm people or manipulate them. You know, I'm wondering if, I think he definitely was mad, really.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd certainly agree that, you know, when you look at his personality profile, there's a distinct misanthropy. There's a distinct self-aggrandizement there. There's a distinct paranoia. There's also, you know, he remained consistently deeply manipulative. And even in the sort of later, when you see the interviews with him where he is in prison in his later life, all these interviews are overtly performative. He's moving through a series of very distinct personas, and essentially giving each interviewer what he thinks they want and what he thinks they expect, and they become kind of power plays. Whether or not whether or not that fluidity is an indicative of a kind of schizophrenia, I certainly think there's a schizoid state to Charles Manson. He was not incapacitated in any way by that. He was able to manipulate it and use it and turn that almost, if you like, into a tool of generating influence. Certain elements of how he was actually setting up that weekend of events. There was a sense of imminent persecution. He'd been talking about Helter Skelter, which was the family's buzzword of an impending apocalyptic scenario. It was never really defined what it would be, but the way that the family would work together and live together on the Spahn Ranch, that they would have a kind of regular sort of almost semi-religious services in which Manson would be preaching from Stranger in a Strange Land, the Bible, his own writings, and so on and so forth. And he would constantly come back to this idea of Helter Skelter, which is a reference from the Beatles, which would be the point in which everything comes down, indicative of both a collapse, but also when everything comes down to us, to you. So he's offering something to the group. He's offering something to the group to maintain that sense of close loyalty, that they're there with him in order to get something. And the scenario that he outlined is that there would be some kind of event which they would inaugurate, which would spark a kind of an apocalyptic race war between the white and black sectors of modern America. That something would happen which would incite and to set off these kind of decades of uneasy tensions. That when that is instigated, they would simply be able to retreat to what they call the bottomless pit in Death Valley, which is a place that they'll be able to live together under the earth as the rest of the earth collapses into a kind of mass civil war. They would be joined inevitably by the Beatles, who have been, of course, been trying to communicate with them through the White Album. And once the world had, and certainly America had nigh on destroyed itself, they would then be well placed to emerge out of the bottomless pit and assume their roles as the rightful leaders, because of course the results of this war would be that there would be no strong leaders to emerge from it, and they would be the only ones to emerge in that role. Okay, so obviously deeply problematic in all kinds of ways. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah. Sorry, your audio
can you hear me?
broke up a little bit, but
Bradley, have I lost you?
So motivating Manson was kind of this sort of fetishization of Hollywood. If he was working around the area before, I didn't realize that he was taken to prison because he was working around Hollywood.
Yeah.
And then the murders were Hollywood related. Was that something that he really fantasized about and was a sort of repeating theme in his life?
Yeah, there's one kind of reading of Charles Manson that he's a kind of frustrated celebrity. He's sort of great act of revenge against the Hollywood elite. There's a sense of he is a sort of failed musician, that he's trying to get a recording contract that he's turned down. Terry Melcher turns him down, and thus the decision to go to that particular house on Cielo Drive is a sort of act of revenge against him. Yes, he is on the periphery of various filmmaking scenes. He's living in a former film set. Spahn Ranch was a kind of Hollywood ranch where they filmed lots of Western movies there. There was a documentary. Various documentary crews were filming the family kind of at work, at play, before all these things happened. And obviously that footage is taken on resonance at the time. I think there's an element of that. There's an element that he sees himself as this sort of outsider. Certainly Terry Melcher himself, whole incident being he narrowly escaped being part of that, and that it's purely and simply. And I think there's an element of that, and I think that would feed into the idea that you've got kind of a sort of ego-based persecution complex. But I think it's maybe slightly more complicated than that, and I think that the motivating factor has to do with, if you like, keeping this group dynamic together. That something's got to be offered, something's got to follow through, something's got to work through. And I think it's very sort of telling that in each of these great points of crisis within the life of Manson and the family, whether that is him actually inaugurating the Tate LaBianca murders, inaugurating the murder of Gary Hinman a few weeks before, and it was sort of the imminence of a kind of police raid on the ranch that sort of sparked the Tate LaBianca murders themselves, but also working amongst the family, where he's orchestrating these sort of orgiastic sessions, he's orchestrating this drug use. He would always stay slightly one step away. He would not be fully involved in this. He would always maintain a certain position of control. And also, he's not actually there at Cielo Drive. He sends this other group, this kind of away team, if you like, for the family to actually do the murders themselves. So, if we were to see it purely and simply as a kind of an enraged ego who can't, this kind of enraged kind of outsider figure who is engaged in this act of revenge, the way in which the event was taking place and the way in which it was fully orchestrated, I think it has a little bit more to do with him tightening this group dynamics. Because, of course, if he's got a group of these people that he already has influence over, that are now responsible for a murder, they sort of now belong to him forever, right? Because, it tightens that group dynamic, and it tightens that dependence even more. I mean, it's deeply problematic to talk about it in those terms, and to sort of, and I also feel slightly uncomfortable each time talking about this, in the sense of, well, let's rationalize this crime. Let's almost try to explain it away and give ourselves a why. But I think the point is, there is an element of this, the functioning of this group dynamics at play here. And I think this comes back to Iona's question about, how did Manson keep this control? How did he exert this control? If you look over the lifespan of the family, it's in increments. It works in the sense of Manson initially offering friendship and some kind of shelter. and then there's a sexual relationship that starts, and then gradually separating people from their wider support network, then bringing someone else in to that relationship, at which point the first person feels that they can't possibly object. Then children emerge, then they're financially dependent, then they're dependent upon the shelter of a growing group, and then, you know, more and more dependency, greater degree of sort of stricture and tightness around this group. So, you know, I think there's a certain, in terms of thinking about what the motivations are, you know, once we actually put aside the strangeness and the intensity of the Helter Skelter project, I don't really actually think that Manson himself actually bought into the prospect of being able to emerge out of a bottomless pit to reclaim the world. I think that's Manson actually working through this idea of keeping a close, coercively connected network and group together.
Can I ask a question about the yippies and
Yes.
the idea, like, was the family in a way based on that sort of thing that was going on there with like sex and underage girls, and that there's a way that it's a bit, you were talking about how it's like a bigger part of a kind of social phenomenon, what happens, and he's kind of borrowing all these ideas. And I just wanted to, I don't know, I'm trying to remember, I think one of the girls maybe had been raped in that scenario and then found a way to Manson. He'd been in Yippie. So I just wanted to sort of talk about that. That was very interesting that I came across, but I didn't quite know how it fitted together. So
well, yeah, I mean, this is what it comes down to, is essentially, you know, Manson is not an outlaw philosopher. Manson is not some kind of prophet. Manson is not the great villainous nemesis of the counterculture. He's not this kind of apocalyptic figure. He is an abuser. You know, he's a sexual and manipulative, and the family works on the basis of a set of abusive and coercive relationships. Manson had a type. It would be young, vulnerable, isolated-looking young women who he felt that he could be the single point of dependence within their lives. Mary Brunner, who was kind of the sort of first sort of member of what actually became the family. She had a job at the time. She was a librarian, and Manson was playing guitar on campus. And what he noticed was that she was about the age of the other students, but not associating with them, because she wasn't a student, she was a librarian. So that she was in a strange position between not really being part of the primary demographics, so she didn't have any student friends, but not being part of the staff and the faculty either. And he was able to pick up on that and zero in on that very quickly. You know, he within, you know, he's offering a friendship, he's being complimentary, he's picking up on a shyness, he's picking up on her lack of experience. He would say that he's helping her work through her father issues. But of course, within a week or so, he's living in a flat. And a short time after that, another woman turns up, right? And then a short time after that, she's given up her job and they're selling their flat and they're buying a bus instead. I don't want to sound like there's any kind of admiration for the strategy involved here, but there's an ability to pick out a target which he feels that his particular skills of manipulation and analysis and feedback and mutual reinforcement are going to be amenable to. That's not to say that there wasn't any violence either. These, you know, but that comes after.
You touched on his aspiring music career. You know, the Beach Boys actually recorded and performed on TV Cease to Exist as Never Known Not to Love, I think they called it.
Never Learned Not to Love You.
Yeah. So did they credit him for that? And was that a source? It was Dennis Wilson, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
And this would have predated the murders. I just wondered how significant that thread was as far as contributing to his sense of bitterness or whatever. If that
well, Dennis Wilson certainly thought that he was on the list, as it were. And Dennis Wilson had the sort of typical Manson experience of, you know, he gave a lift to two of the family, and within a short amount of time, he suddenly finds that a large number of this group is living in his house. He's initially amenable to that. He's friendly. He sees a shared interest in music, and yes, there is this offer to record one of his songs, which, from Manson's perspective, as the title "Cease to Exist." And yeah, there is that kind of bitterness of a lack of due credit. Dennis Wilson does change the lyrics slightly. "Cease to Exist" is this quite. It is this song of coercion. It is this song of almost, if you like, putting into a pop song that idea of intense manipulation and allowing one to be dominated by the other within the sort of codes and the rhetoric of some kind of saccharine love song. When you look at the Dennis Wilson's version, you can say, well, he's sort of turned it into the Beach Boys. He's taken the sort of structure of what is a sort of 3-minute pop song, and he's added the Beach Boys harmonies, and the sort of Beach Boys are turning it from a dreadful, sinister Charles Manson song into something else. He changes the lyrics to Cease to Resist. I mean, I see it as equally, if not slightly more problematic in terms of the chords and the language of the 3-minute pop song, which indicates that there's some kind of resistance and unwillingness there in the first place, which the voice in that second version has to surmount and has to get over. So it's not without its sinister side, but in terms of the sort of biographical details, yes, there was kind of tension, and there was certainly a lot of paranoia on the part of Dennis Wilson that he might be under threat because of his engagement with Manson. Dennis Wilson also attempted to arrange a series of recording sessions for Manson with the intention of recording a whole album, which were sort of strange and chaotic, and they've led to all kinds of rumors that there are these sort of mythical and slightly legendary tapes of what actually took place in those recording studios, chants and recordings of the family members having sex and all kinds of other stuff. So they've become sort of semi-legendary in and of themselves.
Yeah, I have the Manson. I forget what the collection is. I have it on CD. But I did actually find the Beach Boys version quite sinister as well. Like that intro, it's got dark undertones. So
it has, yeah, very much so.
So both Manson and Timothy Leary both used and experimented with LSD. Yet it would appear that they had a sort of different understanding of what they were doing. So how would we understand the differences between Manson and Leary's approach towards LSD?
Manson first took LSD according to most of the accounts, in the Avalon Ballroom in San Francisco, and apparently had a vision of a kind of crucifixion image, sort of a bad trip in an old name, but it wasn't without insight for him. He began to see it as a kind of important visionary experience for him, and certainly the idea of himself as a crucified figure, images of the crucifixion are something that he came back to extensively when his group. Timothy Leary, obviously an enthusiastic user of LSD, obviously someone who's interested in the visionary potential of that. Leary is influenced very much by Aldous Huxley. He dedicates the psychedelic experience, his book, to Aldous Huxley, and he's very much a follower of the idea that it's not psychotomimetic. These substances are not sort of mimicking a madness. They're not mimicking a kind of paranoia. They're not mimicking something. They're actually opening out an experience which is of existential, if not mystical, significance. There's actually something specific here, and it's generative of an experience that one could not have elsewhere. So Leary and Manson would probably agree on that level in terms of the potentialities of it and the significance of taking LSD, and they both approached it in a kind of ritualistic context. When we think about Timothy Leary, and we think about the whole idea of creating the psychedelic experience, which is a version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, he's mapping out a kind of, if you like, roadmap for the experience of taking LSD, and in a different way. Elements of that were also there in Manson's usage and the way it was used amongst the family. It wasn't so much a kind of a social drug as something of a sacrament might be too specific a term to use, but there was a sort of ritual associated with it. It was invested with a certain degree of gravity, and it had a certain place within, if you like, the life and the sort of working week of the family on the Span Ranch. So again, they would be connected on that basis. Both were exploiting what Leary would call the set and the setting. The idea that one's own mindset, one's own surroundings has a big influence upon one's experience and experiences on LSD. They're both very much aware of that. But I think Leary's perspective, although we know these are hardly clinical trials, we could sort of question some of the ethics involved in the extent to which he was encouraging people to try LSD. I think Leary saw himself as a kind of guide, teacher. He saw the personal, if not social, significance of using LSD and gaining access to these experiences, and he wanted to help people through it. He wanted to have people share these experiences, and he saw it as the basis of what he referred to as a new indigenous religion. I think Manson differs at that point, because I think whilst it was couched in ritualistic, semi-religious language, for Manson it was very much a tool of this coercion. It was a tool of this control. Whilst he himself was a user of LSD and had experience of it, he didn't use it as much as the other members of the family within the Spahn Ranch. He would often hold off from taking it, and whilst the rest of the group would take LSD or take a smaller dose. So again, he's in that position of controlling this very uncertain, this very subjective experience, this experience in terms of the tonality and the atmosphere. It can change radically in terms of the setting. He wanted to be very much in control of that set and setting. You know, so you could see in terms of Charles Manson's take on this, it was almost as if he was trying to the kind of group mind of the family as a way to control that with a greater degree of tightness. And I think it might be pushing it in slightly more conspiratorial direction. But I suppose at this point I'm using that as something of an analogy. But I suppose to highlight the difference between Leary and Manson, if we see Leary as a kind of teacher figure, as a kind of almost a sort of spiritual guide, someone who's going to take you through this underworld in a slightly kind of like Dante being guided by Virgil, would be a sort of comparison that would not be out of the question for Leary's field of reference. I suppose Manson's usage is probably slightly more comparable to the way in which LSD was allegedly used, or at least investigated, in terms of the MK-Ultra project, CIA, its potential CIA applications as a truth serum, an interrogation drug, a way of incapacitating enemy forces. So an invading force can merely walk in and take the territory. You know, Manson was trying to do that psychologically with his followers. So he was trying to, you know, open up something of a mental and psychological space so he could maintain control.
You know, in a way, there's just a general sort of similarity, but a real difference in some sort of respects to kind of what's going on here. So it's like there's a sort of general sense that someone like Manson and Leary are using the same tools and the same sort of, even the same context, but they're definitely taking it in a completely different direction. So I think in some ways this sort of leads on to a question that sort of takes us away maybe from Manson himself, but to look at sort of violence in relation to the 60s. So in your book, you explore how the 60s counterculture sort of experimented with violence. And you especially look at the films of Peter Whitehead and the writings of Jeff Nuttall. How is the concept of violence explored and developed in these two figures' work? Yeah,
so Peter Whitehead and Jeff Nuttall, I don't know how familiar people are with them. I'm presuming a degree of familiarity. Jeff Nuttall.
I can show the images as well if you want me.
Yeah, we've got an image of Nuttall and Whitehead if you want to just pop that up.
Yeah.
Jeff Nuttall is a writer, performer, poet. There's Manson. There he is, orchestrating the spectacle. There's Leary, looking for his glasses. And there's Jeff Nuttall there on the left and Peter Whitehead there on the right with his camera. Jeff Nuttall is a writer, poet, performer, and he's probably most famous for a book called Bomb Culture, which was his account of his life and role in the British counterculture, or as we call it, the underground. Filmmaker who made a series of films throughout the 1960s and after, but he's best known for the films that he made during the 1960s, which included things like Holy Communion, Tonight Let's All Make Love in London, and a film called The Fall, which he made in New York in the late 1960s, and that photograph is taken during the production of The Fall. White is also known for a series of pop promos, and he was the first person to make promotional videos for people like the Rolling Stones and Pink Floyd. He's funded in some ways Pink Floyd's first recording session. Nuttall and Whitehead knew each other, and their point of intersection is an event at the Albert Hall poetry reading in 1965, which Whitehead filmed for a film called Holy Communion, which was a big sort of reading, a big poetry reading featuring British and American poets. Allen Ginsberg was there, and a lot of representatives of the British underground, Michael Horowitz, etc., etc. There's another poet there called Adrian Mitchell, who read a poem on that evening, and which it becomes a key part of Whitehead's film Holy Communion. And it's a poem called To Whom It May Concern, which is also known as Tell Me Lies About Vietnam. And it's Adrian Mitchell's poetic reflection on his experience of watching television images of the war in Vietnam. It registers his sort of shock, and it registers the strange position that he feels that he finds himself in upon seeing those images of violence, that he desperately wants to look away, but he really feels that he has to look at them for political reasons. But his initial response is to kind of look away and be sort of pleasantly isolated and sort of insulated from it. So it's this kind of self-lacerating, sort of torturous poem. He's sort of trying to amplify the horror of what he's seeing, but also wanting to be told lies at the same time. And I think this becomes a sort of quite symbolic text, or it's certainly a text that can tie together Jeff Nuttall and Peter Whitehead, because they have similar preoccupations. Their images are their work and their images in various ways are preoccupied with violence, but within that they are very humanitarian. They're sort of shocked and disgusted at the violence that is being committed and exerted on the human body in various theatres across the 1960s, not just in terms of Vietnam, but also in terms of the sort of social cruelties that are being perpetrated, in which they see all around them. So their work sort of variously reflects on this in a very kind of, certainly from Nuttall's perspective, his work is very sort of visceral, it's very corporeal. He produced this little magazine called My Own Mag, which, if anyone's familiar with it, it's sort of a strange combination of the Beano. It's got lots of comic strips in, but it's also like William Burroughs. It's also like Antoine Artaud. It's full of rips and tears and pages are burnt away. And there's lots of scatological and corporeal imagery in there. But it's Nuttall really trying to explore, Nuttall really values the human body, and he really values the kind of human constitution, and he really values human life. So in a lot of his work, it's a big cry of disgust in terms of the damage which is being done to the human mind, the human self, and the human body. And he very much sees the counterculture and the British counterculture being informed by these ideas and being informed by this perspective. He's coming out of CND. He's very much aware and very much anxious about the prevailing Cold War and atomic context, and thus, his take on the counterculture is that it is something that is, if you like, the only kind of reasonable choice in what he refers to as a post-Hiroshima napalm-soaked world. His take on it is to, one has to express these statements of incandescent rage against this, and one has to explore that damage, but as a way to reiterate the value and the importance and the primacy of the human. Whitehead is interested in similar things, but he comes at it from a very different way. In his film The Fall, he was invited to New York to make a film and a documentary about the New York cultural scene of the 1960s. He'd had a great success at the New York Film Festival with a film that he made about London called Tonight Let's All Make Love in London, which is very much a representation of what we might refer to now as swinging London. Although when we look through the film, there's a certain critical impetus on the part of Whitehead. But he was basically invited to make a similar film about New York, its kind of art scene, its creative scene. And the producers involved kind of wanted a sort of light-hearted romp through the city that never sleeps. Whitehead came and spent time in New York, and he found a city variously saturated with violence, a city with an enormously high crime and murder rate. And he found a city in which its counterculture and its underground culture was engaged in various kinds of protest and was moving from a position of non-violent protest to a much more violent, direct action, much more confrontational action, which was crystallized for Whitehead and exemplified by the occupation of Columbia University in 1968. And Whitehead found himself directly involved in this. And the last sequence of the film is him sort of behind those barricades, filming the police as they actually do a raid on the occupiers, on the student body, and we see the actual physical and corporeal damage that's done to those protesters by the police as they are literally pulled out of the building. Before he started work on The Fall, Whitehead had been working on variously a novel, variously a screenplay called Protest, which was a sort of fictional scenario about someone committing murder as an act of political protest, someone committing murder specifically in order to bring a media platform to the individual so he could then talk about the kind of culture of murder that's happening within the Vietnam War. And he sets off making The Fall with the intention of actually realizing that as a fictional film featuring himself. But because of the situations and the climate that he gets into, it becomes more of this sort of documentary account of him being involved in the protest movement as it is shifting in terms of its tone and its tonality. And he's sort of commenting on the sort of, I suppose, the loss of efficiency in terms of the non-violent approach to protest, and particularly protest against the Vietnam War. Whereas Nuttall is working through a very scatological, as I said, very corporeal language. It's very poeticized, very much influenced by William Burroughs. He's interested in the way that language can shock, can be transgressive, can work through various taboos to make the points that he wants to make. Watt is doing something kind of similar, but thinking about the actual form of filmmaking itself. He's interested in, and The Fall reflects quite a lot on the relationship between filmmaking and violence, the way in which one would take up a camera and shoot something, the way in which one would actually cut the film, cut and reassemble and put it together, the actual violence of that act and the way in which that can change what is being represented. So The Fall works on multiple levels. It is ostensibly a documentary account of New York in the later 60s and the way in which its sort of countercultural context move into a very different direction by the end of the decade, but it's also a kind of summation of the kind of work that he'd been producing up until that point, where he's reflecting on the filmmaking process, his own imbrication in it. And the position that he finds himself in at the end of the 1960s is that he feels that he's involved in a very kind of aggressive, assertive, very violent act by virtue of his role as a filmmaker there. You can tell through looking through his diaries and his kind of archival material that he was in quite an extreme sort of psychological position at the time. He began to feel that he was in some way responsible for the death of Martin Luther King. He began to feel very much responsible for the death of Robert Kennedy because his film was being made at that time, that he somehow inaugurated these acts of violence by making a film with such kind of intensity. So there's a lot of his own self in there, but he's sort of working through these ideas of violence and protest through making a film which he hoped would actually have some kind of corporeal impact on the viewer, to the extent that Nuttall's writing and his performances and his poetry, he didn't want to just describe a sense of disgust. He wanted to actually create this kind of vivid, actual, almost causal effect upon the reader. So they're kind of joined in that way.
I don't know if anyone has any follow-ups to that question. Yeah?
No, we're going to watch the films, but no questions.
What you should do actually, and the fall should be the fall has been long delayed. This is a trailer or promo, but there is a release of it, an official release of it being arranged at the moment. The Whitehead's archive is at De Montfort University. Steve Chibnall and Alyssa Clark are handling it very well, and they've arranged for a proper full-on big release of The Fall. So when that comes out, I do very much recommend it.
What department is that?
That's the Department of Film and TV.
Okay.
Well, the Centre for Film and Television Research. So they're working with that. So if you are interested in following any of those materials, that's get in touch with those, and you'll be able to see some of the material that he's working on. The Fall is one of the many things that's very interesting about The Fall is the whole thing is Whitehead was a sort of almost obsessive diary writer, and the whole thing is sort of documented. The journals that he was keeping when he was making The Fall, that he came to refer to as the Fall dossier for a time. They're these sort of wonderful texts where he's working through his ideas for the films, his own personal and private feelings. There are extracts from magazines and newspapers put in. There's his own reviews of his own films that he's kind of deconstructing and interrogating, and there's a whole kind of matrix of material connected to The Fall. But if you're interested in it, it's coming out very soon in a brilliant release, so I'll very much recommend it.
Just like Manson, the 60s was a time for sort of experimenting with religion. So in your book, you discuss how religions such as the Process Church of the Final Judgment, Scientology, the Church of Satan, and along with the sort of films of Kenneth Anger and Alejandro Jodorowsky, how should we sort of understand this sort of development of religion during this period, and sort of what are the sort of overriding themes and interests within sort of...
An interesting way to sort of see that there is this proliferation in the period of lots of sort of varied religious groups. It's slightly unfair to just bandy the word cult around, but let's say there's lots of groups which were referred to as religious cults, the Process Church being one of them, although they didn't really take that view themselves. I think one way we can look at this is to draw upon a line from Joseph Burke's book on counterculture that was published in 1969, and he referred to these varied movements, these kind of varied activities, not just sort of religious groups, but if you like, the counterculture impetus as a whole. He talks about it as a movement away from what he called the parental stem. And I think that's a very good way and a very useful kind of analogy and a useful image with which we can think through these. Because if we think about the Process Church, the Final Judgment, we think about the Church of Satan, if we think about Kenneth Anger and his own sort of mystical worldview and religious worldview that he's working into his films, we also think about, the fact that, at one point the Process Church had a chapter house in Haight-Ashbury. These figures would have also been networking and working amongst themselves and crossing over and overlapping in all kinds of ways. There's a real diversity there, but they're all indicative of this almost a kind of Oedipal movement away from the establishment, away from all the institutions and establishments that we could refer to as occupying that kind of central parental role. A movement away from, if you like, religious and philosophical orthodoxy, and a movement into groups of specific forms of commitment and interest, a movement also away from the Judeo-Christian worldview and everything that comes with that, which is a sort of Protestant work ethic. The idea that if one works, if you like, and suffers, if one deprives oneself of all kinds of things, you'll be rewarded in the afterlife. Some of these groups are sort of saying, well, take it now. That's there in a group like the Church of Satan, but they also take it in a slightly different direction. There's almost a kind of comic book aesthetic at play in the work of Anton LaVey. It's almost a kind of subversive, semi-satirical organization in which they're there to point out the existing hypocrisy in what we might refer to as organized and conventional religion, but also to sort of attack and to criticize the counterculture at the same time. Anton LaVey would famously talk about the early days of the Church of Satan as being his sort of reflection on being an organist, a church organist. And he would be an organist both in a religious and a worship context, but he would also be an organist at a fun fair and burlesque shows. And the thing that he would often say is the people who would come and see the burlesque shows on Saturday nights would be the same people that he would see in church on Sunday mornings. And he was playing the same organ for them. They were just singing different songs. And all the sort of lasciviousness and the desire and all the sort of libidinal energy that he would see on Saturday night, it would all be somehow purged and put away and semi-atoned for on Sunday morning, as if it was purely just transactional and just an exchange. Feel bad for doing these things, well, I'll just put it right for doing this other thing here. And he saw that as massively hypocritical. At the same time, he had a real problem with the sort of stereotypical San Franciscan counterculture, because he thought that this sense of, he thought is very kind of passive, and the invitation to experience a kind of altered state of losing oneself, of moving into a kind of ego-less, a kind of non-mind, the associated movement into a kind of pacifism. He saw that as a kind of movement away from a sense of a strong essential selfhood. He saw that as quite weak. He offered the Church of Satan not as a kind of and necessarily a kind of inversion of traditional Christianity, worshipping a different entity, a different deity. He saw it much more in the sense of acknowledging aspects of oneself, which other religions would require and to instruct one to suppress and to keep silent and to keep out of the picture, would require you to give yourself up to some kind of higher authority. Anton LaVey's perspective is you are the authority, so worship that. You are your own authority. Worship that. And there are certain elements of that in the Process Church, which has its roots in a kind of a sort of pseudo-Dianetic background. It also has this idea, it has this element built into it of wanting the disciples, wanting the members of the church to sort of engage in a process of self-realization, to acknowledge and articulate their own sense of selfhood, which membership of the process church would help one realize. It was a kind of mixture of ritual and therapy, if you like. The process also had a very distinct kind of apocalyptic sensibility. They saw the world going in a particular direction. They're very much aware, like someone like Jeff Nuttall, that this is a post-war generation, a kind of generation which is emerging under the shadow of the nuclear bomb, the ability to sort of annihilate oneself from the world. So they thought that sort of Western culture was poised at the brink of a great change, a step forward, a movement from a position that's problematic in all kinds of ways, but one could move to a very different state of being, and they saw themselves as being there to inaugurate that in a variety of different ways. And I guess this is where they begin to coalesce with someone like Kenneth Anger, whose films like Lucifer Rising and The Invocation of My Demon Brother are there to demonstrate, work through, and in some ways kind of inaugurate what he referred to as the Eon of Horus, something that he's getting from Aleister Crowley. There's Kenneth Anger there in full regalia. This era, this epoch of the child, of the crown conquering child, which is going to be this state of rebirth, of reevaluation. But we begin to think about the language of violence, which is often associated with these kind of groups, because that paradigm shift is always going to be a state of some kind of tribulation. It's always going to be something of a violent position and a violent perspective. It is apocalyptic, because in order to make this revealing, you are essentially asking for, if not inviting, the end of the world as we know it in order to take this step forward. So these groups can be, put under the umbrella of groups that are moving away from a certain kind of conventionality, a certain social mores, a certain form of worship which is connected to a certain kind of social role and set of social expectations. The process used to refer to these people as the Greys, as John Gray, as the sort of the man who lives to work and works to live, and there's nothing else within that life other than that kind of treadmill existence. There's no kind of personality there. So in some ways they were kind of rejecting that kind of life, the sort of sedate and sort of quietly beige suburbia, which in some ways would have been the sort of goal of a kind of post-war life or the post-war promise. They were rejecting that, so that's the rejection of the parental stem, to use Burke's phrase. But I guess they're also connected on with this residual apocalypticism, in the sense that they are looking towards another type of existence. They are promising, and they are trying to inaugurate a new state of being, and that's both kind of positive and optimistic in some ways, but it brings with it also the sense that something's got to end in order for that to happen.
What is making me think of when you said the parental stem, and also about the church repressing, I'm thinking of Louis Althusser's concepts of the repressive state apparatus.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, they're not. I mean, the process church, they're not tied in the sense of the process church weren't reading Althusser. They were reading Robert Grimston. They were reading the indigenous. But no, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, because once we begin to look horizontally, once we begin to sidestep away from these very sort of niche and specific groups, it is no surprise that the process church and similar groups are emerging throughout the 60s, where we have at the same time the kind of post-structuralist reevaluation, where we have Althusser, where we have Foucault and Derrida and Deleuze and Guattari and all these other writers working in different milieus and different contexts, but they're challenging the same structures, right? These things are complementary parallels.
And like also with Foucault, with his concept of madness, standing madness on its head, if you don't fit in, you're mad, so that sort of.
It is a very pervasive, and it's a very kind of entangled network of parallel thinkers, people thinking in a very similar way, who are not necessarily sort of meeting each other in a kind of web-like grand conspiracy. But if we certainly, when we think about a broad countercultural context, when we think about writers like Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, from 1966 to 1969, they're interrogating the concept of the author. We'll just add a few more words, a few more letters to that, and you have a movement against authority, right? That's buried into the concept. These things are not massively far removed from each other. The process is sort of a strange and uneasy, in some ways attractive and very kind of fascinating group that does meld kind of religious ritual with a kind of therapeutic activity. There is something of the kind of anti-psychiatric context, which is that's not necessarily a line of influence, but it's a distinct line of parallel to that. You know, it's not purely kind of mystical in its intent. There's a built-in kind of willingness to work through a position of, if you like, existential significance, which elsewhere would be pathologized. You know, if you could get all these people in a room together, which strangely sometimes people tried to do, but they sort of have not quite the right people, they would have a lot to talk about to each other.
Because it's a bit like trying to make things feel different. Like a bit like maybe say like a cultural revolution, you know, something.
One of the other sort of tragedies of the 60s that you explore in the book is the murder at the Rolling Stones concert in Altamont. So what tends to give that sort of murder an especially haunting character is not so much that it's simply a murder, but like the Manson murders, it fits into a particular set of iconography around the 60s. So in this case, it's the Hells Angels, Satanism, sort of rock and roll. To what extent does this iconography change the way we think about the actual violence?
Yeah, it's really Altamont is a really important event for this narrative. Again, it's one of these things where, you know, the counterculture ends here. It's the opposite of Woodstock. Woodstock was the great kind of celebration, the gathering of the tribes, and Altamont was when they started turning on each other. It has its symbolic role and it has its symbolic life within this story. And as you say, it's got everything that we kind of expect. It comes fully formed. The Rolling Stones are there. They're working through sympathy for the devil. Mick Jagger is there with an Omega sign on his chest. They're self-consciously working through this Luciferian identity. You know, they're within the orbit and the network of Kenneth Anger. They're quite explicitly working with this imagery. The Hells Angels were there. It's an utterly apocalyptic scenario. It's at the end of the year. It's December 1969. You know, the stars are not good. There's all kinds of astrological problems at the time. You know, so it seems to be this event that somehow is almost a kind of magical ritual that somehow ends the 60s. It's attractive imagery, it's attractive language. It also has its own, if you like, microculture of cultural artifacts that follow it. You know, the Gimme Shelter film, novels that have been written about it, a set of resonant and iconic images, such as the one that we can see here. That's all at play there, but of course, you know, 3 people died during this concert. One guy was run over, another died drowned in a drainage ditch, and Meredith Hunter was stabbed to death by Hells Angels, who were nominally there to provide some degree of security in full view of the band. I think sometimes some of this language, which again admittedly is in there, it is in the event. There's the Hells Angels with the sawn off pool cues. They kind of maintain security around the stage by basically beating up anyone who came near them. And Meredith Hunter allegedly pulled a gun. He's a young black man. He's there with a young white girlfriend. He allegedly pulls a gun. He's surrounded by large, intimidating white Hells Angels, and they murder him essentially there in the event. And you know that is a terrible event. And it's a terrible event which is also loaded with an enormous amount of political resonance, and it's loaded with the kind of political resonance that needs to be brought out, and it needs to be remembered. And it's political resonance which not only is extremely important in our own particular climate, but systemically it's also there throughout the 1960s. The problem with seeing Altamont and viewing it as this kind of apocalyptic symbol, again, this kind of traumatic anomaly that kind of crowds in after this wonderful summer of the rest of the decade, is it kind of obscures the sort of human and material tragedy that's also at play there. It sort of makes the event and the occurrences at the event being caused by forces which are somehow excessively outside of the control of those involved in the event. Whereas what we're actually dealing with here is a terribly organized, logistically disastrous event, which brought to the fore a lot of very existing and a lot of extremely hardwired tensions. And it's important that we don't lose sight of that. And I think that rather than, if you like, talking about the sort of Luciferian identity of the Rolling Stones within that event, we need to be remembering Meredith Hunter. We need to be remembering that young man, because, you know, Meredith Hunter's life, foreshortened life, and what happened to him at Altamont speaks in much greater volumes with much more critical emphasis and interrogatory emphasis about the 1960s in its social political context than it does about the Rolling Stones singing Sympathy for the Devil. And that there's a tendency to sort of slightly elide those and slightly lose sight of that element by offering Altamont as some kind of strange conjuration. There's also something of an interest there in terms of, if you like, the sort of media landscape of the 1960s, because Altamont turns into that very quickly. There are certain elements of the 1960s that accumulate a kind of nostalgic resonance, that begin to accumulate a symbolic currency very much after the fact. But, Altamont, like Woodstock, is something that, and this is another element of what I find very interesting about it, is it's almost as if it's involved in its own self-mythologization very quickly, almost as a kind of immediate response to the events not going particularly well. There is a film crew there. There's lots of photographers there. Donald Cammell, who made the film Performance, featuring Mick Jagger. They were filming in the months leading up to the Rolling Stones tour that involved Altamont, and Performance came out afterwards. So the making and the release of Performance, which is this film about violence and magic in some kind of way, Donald Cammell saw it as somehow bookending the events at Altamont and the production of the Gimme Shelter film. And in interviews promoting Performance about 1970, not that long after completing the film and the events themselves, he's already talking about almost the making of the film Performance somehow inaugurating the events of Altamont, somehow actualizing them, somehow bringing it about, as if it is this act of conjuration. So this framing of it happens very quickly. And it also brings in lots of other connections, synchronicities, coincidences. Kenneth Anger is making films like Inauguration of My Demon Brother, which has footage of the Rolling Stones in Hyde Park. It has footage of helicopters landing and Vietnam footage. It has Anton LaVey, it has bikers. Again, it also seems to be strangely predictive of these events. When we're thinking about Altamont, it's a absolutely disaster of organisation. If you thought the Fire Festival was bad, this is awful. But it very, very, very quickly then gets turned into its own myth. But the problem with that is that we tend to lose sight of the very real human tragedy involved. And we also tend to lose sight of the very real human tragedy involved in Woodstock. Woodstock was also a disastrous event. It was organised very badly. There was violence. There was death at Woodstock. But we tend not to see that, nor do we remember that, because it has this imagery as the fabulous gathering of the tribes, which Altamont counters. It was also a terribly badly organised event.
About the role of the mythologizing of the 60s, so something that just sort of struck me a little bit is when you were talking about how it's important with Manson not to try and explain it in sort of concrete terms of this is, there's a pathology to it, blah, blah, blah. Like, how do you try and reconcile this attempt to, at the same time, demythologize the period of the 60s, which was very good at creating this sort of, the way that I look back on it as quite a young person that didn't experience it, is very much in the terms of it's creating a lot of myths, and there's like a lot of utopia and discontent, and people have got very strong feelings about the period.
I think it's got a lot to do with the actual media landscape at the time. This is a decade in which, over the first few years of the decade, television ownership grows exponentially. Television ownership becomes almost you've almost got almost a national audience in the first few years of the 1960s. The availability of equipment to actually make films is cheaper and it's easier to use. This is certainly very much to the advantage of Peter Whitehead, that he was able to make those films because he was able to move quickly with cameras that could only to get right in the place, but they were handheld, they were portable, they were easy to use, they were easy to reload and refill. There's a rapidity to the actual, if you like, the media and technological landscape that is amenable to this very rapid self-representation of the 1960s. We also have a decade in which there's an enormous audience for the popular press, where there's an enormous audience for the kind of the feature article, where there's those publications are getting an international audience. So this idea of swinging London, that appears in 1966 in Time magazine, an American perspective on not just London but a very small element of central London. And whilst it's very easy to look at that and think, well, the world it was representing would be just as alien to most of the American readers of Time magazine as it would be to most Londoners, to say nothing of the people in the rest of the country. We could demythologize it from that perspective and say that swinging London was utterly at odds with the daily quotidian experience of the majority of people who lived and worked in the UK at that time. But at the same time, we've got that, it's, if you like, this very clear and very carefully conceptualized image of a particular city that emerges very quickly out of the decade. There's the potential for the creation of these representations and the dissemination of these representations very quickly. And as a result of that, they take hold and they take root and they occupy a kind of a psychic position very carefully and very tightly and very quickly. And I think that I think the mythologization that you're referring to, you know, when we're thinking about the 1960s and we're thinking about its culture, and certainly when we're thinking about the way in which its end is represented and the way its end is thought about, when we think about myths and mythologization, it's not just the need to point them out as being sort of fictional or untrue. We also need to think about the fact that they sort of emerge fully formed. They sort of emerge from the decade itself. There's very little in the way of a kind of retrospective view. Right? Do you see what I'm trying to get at here? The nostalgia industry also kicks in very quickly. One of the films I referred to later on in the book is a film called Stardust with David Essex, which is about a kind of pop group trying to make their way in the industry. And it was preceded by another film called That'll Be the Day, which is this kind of rock and roll film. Stardust came out in 1974, and the tagline for that is, do you remember the 60s? 1974, right? Okay, so bearing in mind the fact that, you know, to get the screenplay together, they're probably talking about it in 1972. The 60s are barely in terms of this sort of nostalgia industry. There is already this, if you like, the 60s are already sort of separating themselves from the 1960s very early and very carefully and very quickly. I mean, that's got a lot to do, not just with the sort of socio-political landscape, but also the technology that makes that possible and actually makes it possible to mythologize and to put these myths into the public sphere.
Maybe what's peculiar about the 60s is that even though this technology came about in the 60s, we still have access to it now. But whereas, I mean, the 80s and 90s movements in the UK are very much not interested in myth. It's more like, what's the concrete social reality of what's going on? How do we confront this? I kind of wonder if that's the really difficult part about trying to assess what's going on in the 60s, is that the point is to mythologize it from the start. So when you're looking at the Beatles, some of their films that they put together, the point is mythologizing that. So when you're looking for motivating factors for why there is so much myth around something, it sort of becomes hard to say, well, do you want to just accept the fact that it was attempted to be mythologized, or is that something that you want to apply, like the 80s and 90s critique of that culture, to it?
No, that's a very good point. That's a very insightful and very astute point. I'm really glad you made that point. And I think you hit the nail exactly on the head in the sense of, you know, there's an element of fantasy here. There's an element here of fantasy and imagination within the artistic culture, and that idea of creating a myth. I think you're absolutely right in the sense of there is an imaginative projection. There is a sense of the desire to imagine an elsewhere and another world, which I think is there in various forms, in various aspects of the counterculture. And if we just take the Beatles, for example, if we think not just of something like Yellow Submarine in terms of just its lyrics and its as a song, but also the animated cartoon that comes along with that, the animated film. If we think also about Magical Mystery Tour, you know, it takes that thing of that, in some ways, archetypally British and sort of aspirant working class leisure pastime of that, the kind of the tour and the package holiday, but it melds it with magical imagery. It melds it with all kinds of ideas. The tour itself goes further in a much stranger way that it would ordinarily go, but in some ways that's also true of what those packages were also offering. At the same time, that you will go elsewhere, that you will depart your ordinary life, that you will have a kind of experience which will alter your life in some ways, or at least make it more tolerable. If we think about the actual spectacle of that form of travel, which was rolling out in the decade. So when I think you're absolutely right in the sense of, yes, it does make it difficult to actually point to, if you like, the empirical concrete reality. But I think some of that mythography was sort of part of that too. It's certainly part of the way in which it functions and operates. You know, it's there in, you know, the spectacle of it, let's say.
Yeah, but so you've almost got two sorts of mythology going on there. Because if you say that the 90s has got a mythology behind it that isn't quite understood, that is still being revealed to us now, the 60s has got that in double form, because it's got the mythology in which it was based, and then it's also got the mythology in which is almost deliberately placed there. So you're trying to demythologize the mythology, or like understand the mythology of the mythology, which is a bit...
Well, I mean, that's why I was trying to say, I mean, that's in terms of the kind of instigation, the kind of trajectory of this particular book. That's why I didn't want to just say, well, actually, you know, there's all these things about Altamont, and there's all these things about Woodstock, and there's all these things about Manson, but, you know, he was just a con man, so let's not think about it. You know, so we can't talk, there's no point talking about the sort of apocalyptic fantasies of Charles Manson because he didn't actually believe it. I think that needs to be part of that narrative to understand how it worked, and to understand not just the kind of coercive control that individual had at the time, but the traction of this name, of this imagery, of this myth subsequently. In some ways it's become simulacral, in some ways it's become a simulation. I think the Charles Manson t-shirt is not unlike the Mona Lisa in some ways, that it's become almost separate from its point of reference. It just kind of indicates a sort of an ominousness, a kind of rebelliousness, rather than necessarily a distinct adherence to Charles Manson, what he thought about. But I think that in order to understand that reach, and in order to understand that traction in the culture, I think we do have to engage with the mythic elements of it, because that's a key part of the discourse. It's a key part of the language. Mythologization, and certainly self-mythologization, is a key part of the actual, you know, the concrete, if you like, the material fabric of a lot of these works. We go back to Whitehead and we go back to The Fall. If you look at The Fall, the way that it's put together, there's enormous amount of emphasis upon the actual editing of the film itself. You come away from that film with an enormous sense of how this film was actually materially put together, in the sense that you see Whitehead sat at his Steenbeck editing desk actually putting the film together. But at the same time, he's looking at his own face on the monitor, right? So you have a shot of Peter Whitehead here, the real Peter Whitehead, looking at Peter Whitehead on the monitor, who's some other kind of image, some other kind of double. So you have an enormous sense of the fact that this is a material construct that we're looking at here. It's something that he's actually made and put together. So in some ways it bears no relationship to reality. But he's also actively inserting himself into that structure, and that's part of the film. Do you see what I mean? So it's not just, oh, well, he's showing us that the contingency of representation and the fact that it bears no relationship to what it was actually. It's not just a kind of Brechtian device. You're watching a fiction. It's not real. He's actively engaging with it, giving himself to it, to the extent that that representation gains a certain kind of autonomy, as if it's a sort of doppelganger. So it's part of that artwork, and it's part of the actual construction of that film, the creation of that myth and that other self.
That kind of leads quite nicely onto the next question, right? Because so in the book you explore how people like J.G. Ballard and Charles Manson sort of explore kind of inner space and challenge the project of modernity. And so I'm sort of interested in to what extent we can understand these figures, such as Ballard and Manson, as kind of postmodernists.
Yeah, I think you're right to talk about it in those ways, because I think that certainly J.G. Ballard, his conception of inner space, you know, there's two ways that we can see that. You know, he's emerging from a particular context in 1960s science fiction, where he's him and the other sort of New Worlds authors, people like Michael Moorcock and David Barrington Bailey and people like that, they're moving very much away from the sort of space operatics of science fiction, the techno-rationality of science fiction, sort of neo-colonial movement into outer space. And they're interested in terrestrial life, or if you like, the alienness of planet Earth. But they're also interested in, certainly J.G. Ballard is interested in the way in which the inner life is imbricated with that, which we might refer to as the external. So it's not just a kind of introversion, it's about being in a state of entanglement and a kind of feedback loop between the self and one's surroundings, which means that kind of potential dominance of the subject is somehow unseated from being the anchorage within the world. And this is certainly the way in which Ballard then begins to see sort of architecture. It's not something which contains the individual. It's not something which necessarily dominates around the individual, but the individual self enters into a kind of shared inner space, in the sense of one's experience within that space affects projects onto the surrounding architecture, then that has an influence upon the individual, and so on and so forth in terms of their own projection. And this comes out to a large degree in a short story of his called 1,000 Dreams of Stella Vista, in which he imagines and hypothesizes a sort of emotionally responsive house which responds to the emotions of the inhabitants and then affects their emotions in response. And what he hypothesizes is, well, what if you move into a house in which something deeply traumatic had previously happened to there, and the house had somehow recorded it in some way? What is then reprojected back onto the individual, and how is that what then comes as a result of the further logic of that feedback loop? What one also gets in Ballard when he's really exploring these inner spaces is this strange entanglement between, I suppose, what we might call the epistemes of time and space. And this is probably where we begin to connect with more specific postmodern theory, someone like Frederick Jameson in postmodernism and or the cultural logic of late capitalism, where he's making that difference between modernism and postmodernism as being a shift from a primary episteme of time to an episteme of space, what he calls the spatialization of time. It's recording, its representation. And certainly you find that in novels like The Crystal World, or a lot of Ballard's other short stories where space exponentially increases, one loses a sense of time, one accesses a different experience of time, and it changes the representational structure of what he's trying to represent. Ballard in general has a sort of proximate relationship with a lot of the sort of key postmodern theorists, not just Frederick Jameson, but also Jean Baudrillard, who writes about novels like Crash at length within simulacra and simulations. What Baudrillard is interested in the way that Crash presents a novel about kind of pseudo events, the simulation of car crashes, but which also carry with them the sort of causality, the sort of corporeal implications of that. Manson, I think, is slightly different. If we talk about Manson in terms of postmodernity, I wouldn't necessarily see Charles Manson as a kind of agent of postmodernity. I wouldn't really want to go down the road of seeing Charles Manson as a kind of transgressive artist who's working through this kind of postmodern project, as if to say the Tate LaBianca murders were a sort of vast report. To make a distinction, if we actually talk now about the name Charles Manson and the symbolic work that does, I think that he's become something of a postmodern subject, because I think that the image and the name of Charles Manson has become something of a simulacra, as I was implying in the previous point about the Charles Manson t-shirt, which is, it kind of encapsulates a kind of feeling or an aura without necessarily referring to anything in particular. It's possible to go on a Charles Manson tour around Los Angeles if you want to do that. There's all kinds of bus tours. They'll take you up Cielo Drive. The actual house itself no longer exists. It was demolished and the number is changed. So there's no actual site there left. If we're thinking about Manson and postmodernity, if we think about Manson and simulation, we might want to pause and ask, well, what are people actually looking to find when they go on that tour, and where they make the visit to the place that doesn't exist anymore? What are they trying to commune with? Because in one sense, there's actually nothing there to actually tie this location and this space to any of the events that took place. So is that a kind of archaeological movement? Is it trying to find some kind of trace of it? Or is it the entranceway into something which is a little bit more nebulous, an attempt to commune with some kind of aura, if you like, a kind of version of the most photographed barn in America? What are people actually taking photographs of here? So I think when we're thinking about Manson and postmodernity, I think it's a useful critical language to talk about, if you like, his enduring cult rather than the person himself and his actions.
This is something which is really idiotic. So, and this is more of an open question rather than directed. But when we talk about postmodernism as being the enduring sort of legacy of Manson, what do we mean by postmodernism here? Because of my interest in philosophy, I don't really understand the nuances of the difference between the jump from modernism to postmodernism. So what quantifies that jump? Because I mean, like, the ideas like hauntology are still, around with the early modernists as well. So is there an element that I'm missing, or is it just sort of like a more evolved form of hauntology and modernism?
Well, first of all, that's not an idiotic question. That's the first thing I have to say. That is in no way, shape, or form idiotic, right? Okay, so let's not talk about it in those terms. I think also, but I'd sort of nuance. I wouldn't say Charles Manson is the sort of enduring legacy of postmodernism. What I guess the point I was trying to make there is that one could look at the enduring popularity, and I think that's the thing that I have a kind of problem with. And why should this figure actually be popular? I think you could look at the whole kind of Manson industry as a kind of case study of postmodern culture. That's to say, and when I mean it, offering it as a kind of simulation, and I'm taking that term from Jean Baudrillard, and particularly his book Simulacra and Simulations, which he writes in 1981, something which circulates in the absence of a link to a direct reference point. It becomes a simulacra, a copy without an original. We've moved from it being anchored to a line of reference, a line of significance, and it circulates in a kind of free-floating way. And I think that's certainly what we have when we think about, Charles Manson appearing on record covers, bands doing covers of Charles Manson. Are they actually harking back to this set of events which took place in August 1969? But are they evoking a certain kind of mood? What is actually being conjured here? What was Trent Reznor trying to get at when he decided to move into CLO Drive to record The Downward Spiral? How could you not see that as anything else other than a kind of morbid exercise in reveling in a kind of murder site? He says it didn't have anything to do with that, but what is he actually trying to engage with? So there's some kind of disconnect there. There's some kind of disconnect between the representation and the point of reference. So that's why I was talking about it in terms of the order of simulation and positing that the way in which we engage with, if you like, the cultural product of Charles Manson is an engagement with something of a simulacra. And I'm taking that phrase from Baudrillard, meaning a copy without an original. I think postmodernity is also of use to think about some of the ideas that we looked at thus far. We could look at the general ideas of Jean-Francois Lyotard from the postmodern condition, where he talks about an incredulity towards meta-narratives. He talks about the loss of the primacy and the power of grand narratives. And I think that's a very good and insightful way to think about the stuff that I was talking about earlier about the movement away from this parental stem, the proliferation of small groups of niche interests, religious groups, non-standard religious groups, cultish groups, self-generated religions. One could analyze in terms of the fact that this grand narrative of the Judean-Christian worldview is somehow at some historical point not enough to offer a kind of social glue. It loses its authority, okay? And what I was talking about in terms of bringing in Frederick Jameson, he writes in his book, Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, he's talking about the way in which, there's a shift in terms of the production of art and culture in the way that he sees it in the sort of the later decades of the 20th century that seem to be distinct enough to hypothesize that there's been some kind of movement beyond or movement away from the stereotypical precepts of the modernist project, okay? I guess by bringing in those three key theorists, and this is why your question is not at all idiotic, right, and why you haven't missed anything, the fact that they're there to sort of, those kind of key big three of postmodernism, Frederick Jameson, Jean-Francois Lyotard, Jean Baudrillard, they're all equally trying to diagnose and to think through the dominant, if you like, structures and modes of thought of, broadly speaking, the post-1945 world, okay? Because that socially political context seems to be substantially different from that which led up to it. And there's a variety of reasons for why we might want to hypothesize that as being different. Because quite simply, at the end of the Second World War, for a variety of reasons, the world is not the same place as it was at the start of the Second World War. We've moved into a very different epoch. We've moved into a very different, not just socio-political and demographic environment, but we've moved into a very different militaristic, we've moved into a very different technological, we've moved into a very different economic environment, which presumably is going to bring with it a shift in the way in which people think and a shift in the way in which people interrelate. So, these theories collectively are trying to understand that, and they're offering a series of different tools ranging from, Lyotard's perspective on grand narratives to Jameson hypothesizing a shift in an episteme, to Baudrillard talking about orders of simulation. They're collectively there to decode that period. What I see in terms of the 60s is a decade which is notable for the way in which these ideas seem to be particularly pronounced in a number of figures, artists, writers, whatever, who are not necessarily being influenced by these writers in a kind of cultural clairvoyance or seance mediumship, but there's that parallelism there, which is the point I was trying to get at talking to Iona earlier on, where, you know, the process church is not being influenced by Louis Althusser, but their ideas are not that distinct in terms of, you know, Althusser just happens to call it ideological state apparatus, and the process talk about the sort of malevolence of John Gray. Do you see what I'm trying to get at?
So relates to class struggle, though. I don't know if the church does.
I'm not trying to reduce the complexity of it. I'm just, if we can talk about these things in some kind of proximity, I think lines of citation and influence. There's shifts in thought, and there's movements that there's the shifts in thought which are, you know, very different in tone in terms of language, but they occupy a certain kind of parallelism. So, you know, that's what I'm sort of trying to get at by talking about and hypothesizing, or at least trying to utilize the tools of postmodernism and postmodern theory to talk about certain aspects of the 1960s. As you point out, Harvey, the 80s and 90s seem to be kind of very different in terms of the cultural production. You know, the 1960s is a kind of transitional point moving towards that. That's kind of a very long-winded way of saying it's not idiotic to answer this, but it's not idiotic to answer this, but I'm trying to sort of utilize and employ a certain kind of toolkit.
So do you think that it's less useful than before? Not to say that it's not, but sort of the more sort of classical ideas, the sort of more Marxist ideas, that in some way the Manson family, this sort of countercultural movement, was not part of some sort of structure which reflected the mainstream culture, was kind of amongst it, mirroring it, sort of like, I suppose, inverting it, but they're not in this sort of citational way, but still in this sort of totalizing systemic.
Yes, I think that's slightly, I think my take on it is the sense that they wouldn't be, I mean, you talked about inverting it, mirroring it, whether the it is the counterculture which the Manson family allegedly sort of, you know, terminates. They did certainly see themselves as a kind of inversion of, if you like, the mainstream world, let's say. One of the way, but this is complicated by the fact of, to what extent is there kind of an intention or a design or a commitment to that viewpoint on the part of Charles Manson? Because one of the ways, and this goes back to the early, very insightful question about, you know, how does Manson actually do this? One of the ways that he would sort of encourage a kind of both loyalty and isolation was to highlight this sense that, you know, the world is against you. It is very much us and them. And he would refer to the family as the garbage people. You are the people that the world has thrown away. You are the misfits. I am the only person who sees your potentiality and your value. You will not get it from anybody else. You know, he would often send members of the family off to raid the bins of local shops to get the food, which was both a kind of practical exercise because they lived with no form of discernible employment, but it was also something that was very much reiterating that position of social exclusion and extremity. So, you know, I think it goes back to that point of you know, is Charles Manson a kind of inverted mirror of society? He would probably say that he was, but from the perspective of that kind of mind game. Do you see what I'm trying to say? That's why it becomes that's why I think it becomes a little bit complicated to try to distinctly, or to sort of monologically define what was actually going on in the psychodynamic of the family. I suppose that just like one really quick final thing is that example that you gave about looking through bins, right? So the countercultural thing, that the duality of which you perceive the iconography of that period, right? So at the same time he's saying that you've been thrown away, but then there is still, you don't need to necessarily have some sort of citational critique, necessarily postmodern critique, looking back at how we got to this point to have this position. He was using the images, the sort of totalitarian structure of that time to reinforce the point that these people were garbage, whilst also trying to use it to say, this is why you're part of my family. Yeah, I agree with you, very much so. And that's it. You know, I think that's why we need to, you know, by taking time to actually think through the complexity of something like the Manson family. It's not to sort of give it, again. It's not to speak about it as a kind of admirable project, but there's a complexity there which I think needs to be sort of theorized and diagnosed, precisely for the purposes of criticizing and interrogating the coercion and the manipulation on the part of Manson himself.
In your book, you've got this. It's quite an interesting, it's about like 166 in the book. You start off by saying post-colonialism, the death of the author, the mysterious expanse of inner space, the poverty of the old stories. In the helter skelter of the world of postmodernism, a series of gaps appeared across the once familiar map of contemporary Western culture. And then you go on a bit later to say, you know, Charles Manson was a symptom of this shift, but then, you know, he, where this is a shift that's challenging sort of authority, Manson tries to use that to set himself up as that sort of the voice of an authority.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Very good point. Very well put. But offensively using a kind of language and working in parallel with a set of ideas which have at the basis of a kind of elsewhere an emancipatory and liberatory intent. You know, and certain elements of it, like his kind of overtures to potential family members, carries some of this language. You know, I will set you free. You will be truly free with me, etc., etc. You know, we can broadly parallel elements of the kind of structure at play and the kind of architecture at play here with some of those kind of broad strokes ideas which share a kind of emancipatory and liberatory intent, but it's creating a gap for him to then step into. You know, there's the other side of the coin, which is, of course, Roman Polanski going on to make his version of Macbeth relatively soon after the Manson murders. I think we have an image of it here, which Bradley is kindly going to show. You know, obviously, Macbeth is a pre-existing set of material. There's J.G. Ballard, there is. Pre-existing set of material. It's a very, very old play, and there's been lots of previous versions of it. You know, Polanski's version of Macbeth, it's very violent. It's very bloody. He did this screenplay with the Shakespearean critic and director Kenneth Tynan, and there's a sort of apocryphal story that Kenneth Tynan asked Polanski why there was so much emphasis on the sort of violence and the gore of this and the blood, which of course is there in the play, but Polanski seems to be bringing it out to quite a distinct intent. And Polanski's response was reportedly words to the effect of, well, you didn't see my house last year. Okay, you know, I know all about blood, and implicitly that's what I'm trying to get at. So, you know, Rosemary's Baby is a film that sort of, with quite a rapid degree of attention, is said to be this sort of cursed film that somehow predicts or in some way inaugurates the Manson murders. But Polanski's version of Macbeth is, you could make a more convincing case that it's Polanski's reflection on those murders and his experiences of that, using the medium of this long established Shakespearean play. If it's not just, you know, that might be extending sort of credibility to say that every element of it is psychobiographical. We might want to point to other elements of the film and the fact that, you know, if we compare Polanski's Macbeth to, say, Orson Welles' version of Macbeth, you know, Orson Welles' version of Macbeth is, the character is much older. You get a sense that this character is sort of weathered with experience already. So it all begins. Polanski casts John Finch in the role of Macbeth and Francesca Annis in the role of Lady Macbeth. They're both very young. They're both very beautiful. John Finch looks like a kind of pseudo Mick Jagger figure. There's something musician-esque and sort of rock and roll-esque about John Finch. You know, we might want to question whether or not we want to go down the purely psychobiographical role about Macbeth and Polanski's version of it. But there's certainly something there about youthful optimism being corrupted in a state of violence, ambition, and about the movement from some optimistic phase to moving into a state of decay. And I think there's something in that which is worth seeing as a kind of comment on, or some kind of analog to, you know, it's in microcosm, this idea of the end of the 60s, that there's promise, that there's optimism, but it comes to some kind of disastrous end, and it certainly does in Macbeth. But the sort of visuals and the imagery of that are quite persuasive, and of course the rest of the films that John Finch goes on to do sort of led a certain credence to that. He has a kind of micro career as being something of a semi-countercultural icon. One of the films that he follows up with is The Final Programme, an adaptation of Michael Moorcock's Jerry Cornelius novel. So, you know, there's a sort of a kind of intersection of references and citations which actually follow the Manson murders and Rosemary's Baby, you know, which is kind of the other side of the coin, which is often slightly obscured by a tendency to see Rosemary's Baby with such intensity as being this strangely talismanic, if not cursed, film.
Right. The Tenant's a little bit like that as well. Was that made of?
Yeah, because there's certainly elements within Rosemary's Baby where, you know, Polanski's drawn upon his own interest. There's big elements of repulsion. There's big elements of cul-de-sac, but it's actually also extremely accurate in terms of the novel. If I really. Novel is spectacularly nuanced, and for all the sort of gothic excess of its central plot, it's a very kind of well-crafted, very well-observed novel about gaslighting, claustrophobia, about, you know, domestic space, social aspiration, and as much as there is in Rosemary's Baby in terms of Polanski's sort of thematic ideas, it's extremely accurate to the novel. So that's a sort of slight riposte to the idea that Rosemary's Baby is sort of entirely kind of Polanski's vision and his sort of psyche and personality writ large, because it's, you know, the novel is pretty much scripting it almost frame for frame.
The 60s was a period of sort of intense political violence and paranoia. So on the one hand, this tends to emerge for those opposed to the counterculture, sort of post sort of McCarthyist right, to which the sort of assassinations of Kennedy's, MLK, and members of the Black Panther would seem to correspond. On the other hand, your book explores the sort of conspiracy theories are in the work of Robert Anton Wilson, Mae Brussell, the sort of political militancy of the Weather Underground. So how should we think about the relationship between political violence, conspiracy theory, and the 60s?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's all sort of there in the period. I think certainly in the current political situation, I think conspiracy and conspiracy theorization has, if you like, an increasingly problematic role if we think about, you know, the link between conspiracy theory, people like entities like QAnon, and you know, accusations, unfounded or not, as to various kinds of involvement in social media excess and so on and so forth. I think the thing about conspiracy theory in the 1960s is very much there in the fabric. It remains a kind of form of narrativization. And whilst we might want to look at people like Mae Brussell as occupying the sort of stereotypical image of the sort of lone paranoid theorist, a lot of what she was writing about at the time, particularly about MK Ultra, about what's called Operation Chaos, whilst the links that she was actually making in terms of her own narrativization and the points of emphasis that she was drawing about, you know, she was actually talking about things that went on to be documented, went on to be revealed, went on to be substantiated to a certain degree. I think what, you know, there's, and something like Operation Chaos and the way in which the Nixon administration was trying to roll back the progressivism of the counterculture, both in terms of black radicalism and also in terms of what they regarded as a breakdown in the status quo, to sort of preserve this kind, the political influence of this kind of middle America, the silent majority, and so on and so forth. This part of this shift to the right that we see in the 1970s, you know, it was overtly conspiratorial. You know, we got you know, subversive activities, we've got kind of seditious activities on the part of the administration infiltrating certain groups, and of course we have the kind of the Watergate episode also. So, you know, it's very much in the air, and it's also kind of substantiated as well. But that doesn't stop the conspiracy theorizing from holding on to this position of a kind of creative speculation, a particular kind of narrativization which attempts to bring order to certain things, bring certain things together in which there perhaps may not be a line of causality between them. And there's elements of this within the counterculture, and I suppose this is what Robert Anton Wilson reflects upon in his Illuminatus trilogy. But I think the moment that kind of crystallizes it for me, and the moment that I try to draw emphasis from it in the book, is a moment in the Woodstock film where, in the big documentary of the Woodstock Festival, which was released by Warner Brothers in 1970, there's lots of vox pops there. There's beautiful and fantastic footage of all the acts. There's loads of vox pops with the people in the crowd. At one point in the film, the cameramen are called over by two guys who are sort of stood there in the rain, and they're kind of complaining about the extent of this sort of torrential downpour. And they're pointing to the fact that there's planes flying over, and they say they're seeding the clouds. They have made it rain, right? And the sort of accusation, the speculation is that there's something happening in the atmosphere. The stereotypical the stereotypical hidden establishment, have sort of made it rain on the Woodstock Festival to sort of diffuse and to neutralize its potential radicalism, its potential kind of collective force and emphasis to sort of neutralize and to disrupt the gathering of the countercultural tribes. This all smacks of the LSD in the water supply type scenarios. But at the same time, there were cloud seeding activities taking place elsewhere. As attempts to disperse and to disrupt cyclone formations, to alter different weather patterns with varying degrees of success. So there are certain elements of what we might call the kind of conspiratorial elements of the 1960s that occupy those two zones of both speculative narrativization, but also, actuality, as in, socio-political conspiratorial activities. And I think when we look at something like the 60s, we again have to keep that oscillation active. And I think that's what's very important about someone like Robert Anton Wilson in his Illuminatus trilogy, in the sense that he's sort of crafting a fiction out of a lot of conspiratorial material. And he's crafting a fiction out of it. He draws extensively on a lot of the letters that he was receiving when he was editing the letters pages of Playboy, and a lot of that material veered towards the conspiratorial, talking about flying saucers, talking about Illuminati, all kinds of political conspiracy. I mean, he crafts this sort of elaborate, sort of cut-up fiction out of it. But it's not just a satire of crazy, paranoid conspiracy theorists. It's as if he's almost trying to point to something and to talk about certain elements of truth, so-called, certain elements of political manipulation, certain elements of political subterfuge, through using this very elaborate imaginative language. So again, it's this text that seems to occupy both spheres, about being a fiction and being this sort of almost semi-comedic material, but he's also trying to allude to the mechanism of this kind of thinking and what it actually might do to the world.
In a way, the Manson incident sort of puts the sort of positive elements of hippieism in the 60s into disrepute, and you think to yourself, well, in a sense, although it was a very high-profile case, maybe is it possible the media's taken it up for those reasons, because they wanted to swing to the right?
Yeah, I mean, another way of seeing it is that basically they were kind of waiting for a Manson. There was a Manson-shaped hole in the media landscape that Charles Manson conveniently stepped into, because, the case has everything that one could expect. It has murderous hippies. It has hippies who commit murder as a result of abusing each other. It also allows you to talk about, apocalyptic fantasies, apocalyptic philosophies, but at the same time, it also allows you to talk about Hollywood decadence, because it's not just, as I said earlier on, it's not just Hollywood that it brings to bear. It's Roman Polanski's Hollywood which it brings to bear, which again, something else which was very quickly started to circulate was rumors of links to the mafia, rumors of links between Roman Polanski and Satanistic groups who might be taking revenge on certain elements of Rosemary's Baby, rumors and accusations of pornographic films featuring him, Sharon Tate, and other elements of the Hollywood elite. So talking about this case also allowed you to talk about those other elements. So it was the kind of, it's gold for any newspaper or magazine editor, more so than the other kind of instance, which also speak of the problems with the counterculture, the so-called drug culture. In 1967, there was a murder in New York, one of the over 1,000 murders that took place in New York in 1967, which has become known as the Groovy murders. James Groovy Hutchinson, who was a kind of low-level drug dealer, was found sort of beaten to death in a sort of bunker room in New York with a woman called Linda Fitzpatrick, who was sort of his girlfriend. And it's basically a kind of drug bust that had gone wrong, and they were both killed. And the subsequent reporting of it drew on the fact that Linda Fitzpatrick was the middle class girl who got involved in the counterculture. Why would someone want to leave a stable, secure home to get involved in people like that? So again, it was this case that was able to sort of metonymically stand in for a lot of social anxieties, but it didn't have the additional elements that the Manson case has. It didn't have those additional links, and it's that those intersectionalities and it's those kind of additional forms of symbolic currency that have given it such weight and have given it such a long shadow. You can do Mercantile Way, but you can do more with the Manson case from a narrative and symbolic perspective than you can do with the Groovy murders from 1967.
Because I suppose one of the risks with the fact that the narrative that says that, you know, Manson emerges from the 60s is also that conservative narrative that is saying the 60s are somehow wrong. I suppose it's that conservative narrative that's speaking into that conservative narrative that says in some way.
Yeah, it's kind of a social decadence. It's leading society and its inhabitants into some kind of decline. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not just, you know, Manson moved through the 60s, whether you like the idea or not. He emerged from the 60s in the sense of he gathered his group together, he perpetrated these acts in the 60s. The level of causality that you put that in terms of being a product of the counterculture, the ultimate logic of the counterculture, what the counterculture inevitably leads to, I think that depends upon one's own political position. And yes, there is a lot of this sort of conservative narrativization that sort of, I mean, it's hard to not see the human tragedy and human atrocity linked to that case, but the sort of weighting that you add to that and what you subsequently do with that weighting, I think, you know, that varies quite considerably across the political spectrum. You know, there were elements of the far left that were actually more celebratory of Charles Manson. You know, the Weather Underground saw Charles Manson almost as a kind of a symbolic figure to follow. They talked about Charles Manson power as if he was actually part of the new left. There are other underground newspapers that referred to 1969 in a semi-celebratory fashion as the year of the fork, in reference to the utensil that was used in the LaBianca murder. So it was uneasily celebrated in other aspects of the cultural life.
It's also a way of sort of putting a sort of a charismatic man and making him the sort of problem, as opposed to looking at the sort of social problems, which would be, why did these young people feel so sort of alienated and depressed that they would, go and commit all these awful things? So it's a way of bypassing the actual. And in fact, the other thing about that was he actually came from a really terrible background, didn't he, Manson? And he'd been to a really terrible boys' school, I think, where they used to murder some of the kids. There was a sort of program about that school, and I thought, well, I mean, you're not excusing Manson, but you can see where he came from.
Very much so. Yeah, there's a real problem in seeing him as the sort of exceptional bad seed, you know, because it makes these issues that he symbolizes and that he's used to talk about, you know, it reduces that to the sort of the anomalous work of one individual, in the sense of, there, as you said, there's no problem with society. It's this person who's come in who's spoiled it all. You know, that's another you know, sort of interpretive problem that's connected to this idea of seeing Manson as the singular kind of ad hominem anomaly that emerges fully formed in the late 1960s. It obscures all that. You know, that's where we have these, you know, you see that in the kind of this, just in the cinema that follows. You have this kind of reactionary movement in the cinema. You have, you know, things like Dirty Harry coming out in 1961, which is ostensibly an adaptation of the Zodiac murders. In some ways, it's very accurate, but you know what little was known of the Zodiac murderer would put him as a probably ex-forces, probably in his 40s. Whereas in Dirty Harry, the Scorpio figure, he's clearly coded as a hippie. You know, he's young, he's got long hair, he's got a paisley shirt, he's got bell bottoms, you know. So Dirty Harry is kind of running after the recalcitrant and psychopathic counterculture. It's very clearly coded in those ways.
In the book, you also move into the sort of the way that in the 70s, movements like the Weather Underground start to move towards violence and sort of political radicalism in a sort of in an overtly violent sense.
Yeah, I mean, pseudo-terroristic. It's not just overtly violent. It's a bombing. It's a domestic bombing campaign. The shift that Whitehead represents in the fall, the group that is occupying Columbia University, you know, they're coming out the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Weather Underground is a sort of splinter from that group. It has its origins it has its sort of intellectual and discursive origins within that context. So the Weather Underground is this group that sort of follows on from the context that Whitehead represents in the fall, and it's overtly an underground movement. You know, they have this sort of conference in 1969, which sort of in some ways announces their disappearance, if you like. It announces the start of a kind of a domestic war campaign against America and against American imperialism, which manifests itself as a campaign of domestic terrorism. And they're not the only group to do this. You have the Angry Brigade in the UK, to a lesser extent King Mob. You have the Red Army faction, the Baader Meinhof group. Whilst we can also think about the late 60s and into the early 70s as being a point where we see a kind of conservative reiteration against the social progressivism of the 1960s, there's equally a movement to the extreme left, and we have a kind of a series of radical groups who are engaging in. I mean, it's not even pseudo-terroristic. These are the tools and the tactics of domestic terrorism.
Towards the end of your book, you seem to find hope in turning to landscapes and time capsules in order to, as you say in your discussion of John Mitchell, make manifest the New Jerusalem. In what ways and to what extent can landscape and time capsules help us, quote, revive the radical faith of the 60s?
Yeah, I had a few things in mind when I was talking about that. I suppose part of my mind was, when I was writing this book and when I've been talking about some of these ideas elsewhere, a question that often came up is where, can we point to a sort of contemporary counterculture? If I'm making the claim that the so-called end of the 60s, this sort of declinist reading of the 60s and the counterculture is something of a myth, it's there to talk about other things. If we can look at various strands of this impetus moving into the 1970s, where is the sort of pre and post-millennial version of this? Where might be the 21st century version of this? What are its concerns? What are its priorities? I think one can look around and see quite a lot of work, certainly at the moment, which is thinking about the so-called natural landscape. This is work that engages with certain elements of folk horror. This is a work that's engaging with matters of ecology. There's maybe from a kind of ontological perspective, there's lots of work which is dealing with the rural landscape. It's drawing upon earth mysteries. It's drawing upon certain elements of ley lines, which is the thing that John Michel was writing about in The View Over Atlantis and The Flying Saucer Vision. So, so you can make an argument that some of this language and some of this imagery is sort of recurrent in this sort of spectral, residually supernatural kind of work that involves a particular magical or enchanted view of the natural landscape that's drawing upon certain elements of the 1960s, but also looking at pressing contemporary and ecological concerns. Someone that I might have in mind for that one could highlight as an example of this is the writer and artist English Heretic, who people might be aware of, Andy Sharp, who does these very complex visitations of areas that have a certain degree of importance to certain films, particularly cult cinema. And he's often thinking about the connections between these landscapes and certain elements of magical or psychogeographic practice. And in one of his essays called Locus, the site of The Witchfinder General, the Michael Reeves film, it's also the site of Yoko Ono and John Lennon's film called Apotheosis, made a year later. And it was also the site of a film, it was also one of the shooting locations for a film called The 13 Chairs, featuring Sharon Tate. And what was very much interest to English Heretic in that essay is that this small English village of Lebanon seemed to be a momentary crucible for all these figures who are essential to this, what he called the darkening endgame of the 1960s. In the sense that there would have been one point in which, when Sharon Tate was making The 13 Chairs, she would have looked out of a shop window and seen the very same square where Witchfinder General was filmed, but also a few months later, Yoko Ono and John Lennon would have turned up the day before Altamont and filmed this film where they take off and seemingly escape from the world in a hot air balloon. The other thing I had in mind was one of Peter Whitehead's later films called Fire in the Water from 1977, which is this wonderful visionary film about another kind of Whitehead analog, another Whitehead double, seemingly retreating into a rural landscape, take stock of his career as being a 60s filmmaker. And ostensibly, it seems to be a film in which he's retreating to the landscape to try and just forget it all, to literally throw away filmmaking. There's a scene of him spreading these film cans into this stream and letting them just drift off, like he's so disillusioned and burnt out with it all. He's got to sort of escape and get rid of it. And that film features Natalie Dillon, who also has tangential links to Sharon Tate. And she moves through this very strange, seemingly quite supernatural, shamanic experience where it's not made clear in the film, but she either disappears into the landscape is somehow absorbed by it. But there's a very interesting scene where she sort of submerges herself in water and that she ends up in this capsule, this kind of crystal capsule. And the crystal box is a kind of essential symbol for Peter Whitehead because it's this space of refraction and transformation. So it's not just imprisonment from this character. It's a space where they seem to be transforming into something else but lying dormant at the same time. And to go back to English Heretic, when he was thinking about Lebanon, and Michael Reeves, he laid what he called a black plaque. He went to the site to lay a magical offering. And he talked about that as a kind of a terma, as he called it, using a phrase from Tibetan Buddhism, which is meant to be this sort of capsule, this kind of hidden knowledge, something that's placed in the landscape for future adepts and future disciples to find at a time which is more amenable for that faith and that worldview to emerge. So what I was trying to get at in putting those two things together is they both seem to talk about there being something in this landscape which is buried that's sort of waiting for rediscovery. And I was trying to also connect that slightly more polemically to this idea of, if we need to be thinking about a counterculture today, what's our point of resistance? What's our point of opposition? What do we also need to form a collective? And there is something about having an actual place. There is something of being habituated. There is something about this desire to see off a kind of precarity, which seems to circulate so pervasively and so malevolently about the exclusionary nature of the housing market, the inability to gain property, the inability to gain traction and to gain some degree of permanence. So I guess what I was trying to sort of symbolically get at the end of the film is, what do these films, like a film like Fire in the Water, what does a sort of contemporary work that's engaging with these same myths, again, what are they actually talking about? What are they communicating in excess of their imagery? I think it is indicative of the fact of that which we see in the 1960s. If we're going to bring it out of more than a sort of reconstructive nostalgia, these are the issues that we need to deal with, both in terms of resolving in order to have that collective impetus, but also what we should be aiming that energy towards. And if we think about what are the, I suppose, to go to your questionnaire, what are the kind of key problems? We lack that support. We lack the promises of this kind of socialist utopia, which at one point in the post-war world was potentially being offered. We're in a dissipated, atomized state in which we have very little connection to a specific sense of place. And there's so many kind of examples of what was the counterculture actually trying to do. We see repeatedly not just this sense of to create a new world, whether that be kind of imaginary or a kind of psychedelic movement into some kind of psychedelic zone, but we see enclaves. We see the attempt to make the Haight-Ashbury area into this kind of autonomous city within a city. We have the Free City movement operating in London, linked to the International Times at the same time. We have the kind of squatters movement at the same time. They're trying to actually claim some kind of traction and claim some kind of place in a space which is otherwise hostile. I think it's that element that we perhaps need to be reviving, supercharging. That's our kind of genetic connection, and if anything, our inheritance that connects us to this countercultural impetus. And I think that some of that needs to be remembered, and I think certainly that's what we need to be directing those images at. And that's, I suppose, what I was trying to get at the conclusion of that.
Is it Portland where they're doing their own little
town?
No,
yeah.
And also in the Egyptian Revolution, I thought that was all very interesting. In the square, is it Tahrir Square? Anyway, in the big square, everybody was camping.
And Whitehead was absolutely fascinated by that, by the way. I got to know him quite well around that time. And certainly thinking about the Arab Spring, thinking about the Occupy movement, he was seeing a direct relationship, not just, he was seeing a repetition of what he was seeing in the fall, what he was representing in the fall, but he was also he was very interested in these movements which were reclaiming various spaces, which were creating these microcosms, or as he would put it, these kind of crystal boxes, these capsules within wider states. So what I came to see a film like Fire and Water as representing.
Funny how these sort of things emerge sort of organically, and also don't seem very hippie. Wide range of different types of people.
Just going to say that I'm shooting off. I've been working all day and I'm starting to lose concentration. But it was a really interesting talk. So thank you.
Yeah, well, I think I've actually done
very much indeed, Harvey. Thank you for your fabulous questions. Everyone's questions and interventions have been absolutely great. Thanks very much for taking the time to think through them. And again, absolutely not idiotic whatsoever. Can't say that.
I'm incredibly arrogant. Don't worry. It was all hyperbole.
You're just pretending. You.
All right. See you later, everyone. Thank you.
Cheers, Harvey.
About the Gilets Jaunes movement, in France, it's the same sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, it's very strange. It emerged sort of organically, You think, well, you don't really need to have ideas of the way people are going, because they sort of seem to do it, the people themselves. And they had this idea, they had a sort of little kind of slight pockets sort of came together, and kind of spokespeople emerged from that. And they were very clear they really didn't want to unite with any of the parties, and it went on like that. It was all quite powerful. I thought that's really interesting. That's the sort of, coming up from...
No, you're absolutely right. That organic, I mean, it would be easy to look at that and think, oh, well, in terms of the location, the representation, some of the imagery, here we have a kind of return of 1968 and pulling the cobblestones up in terms of, we have a sort of street-based movement in and around Paris. But I think you're actually right in terms of your very good and insightful point at the start of that, in the sense of it came organically, almost as a kind of form of behaviour, that groups would emerge together, almost if there's almost a kind of swarm aesthetic to it. That's actually what we're seeing here in terms of a kind of recitation of something. We're actually seeing this kind of human behaviour towards this kind of collectivity.
Yeah, and also...
Well, I think it's just been really great having you, James. It's been really...
Well, thank you very much, Bradley. It's been an absolute pleasure on my perspective to be here. Yeah. I'm really glad that you asked me along to do it. And I thought all the questions were wonderful, and everyone is really on the button.
Well, one of the things that's actually just good about the book and your talk today is that there's so many different elements to it that it just gets you thinking about things you wouldn't necessarily always think together.
That was exactly the point that I was trying to get at, that I wanted it to be that. That's what I was hoping was kind of create that kind of uncanny effect, that this is something that we know about, who doesn't know about the 60s, but there's bringing in, talking about unfamiliar stuff, but also talking about unfamiliar stuff in relation to things that are perhaps a little bit more well known. So there's this story there, but there's sort of dissonance along the way. That's really what I was trying to get at.
Because the only reason I know is because we had a guest who was talking about Mark Fisher's Acid Communism. And it sounds a bit like that, but it sounds rather better. From what I'm understanding, your work sounds better. Although I haven't read that, though, but...
Oh, it's very kind. That's very kind.
That was an unfinished text, wasn't it? But,
it was, yeah. Okay.
Oh. Well, thank you so much.
No problem. I'll let you go. Let you go. And get a drink and get some more
I think I need some more water.
Okay, great. All right, then. Well, thank you very much indeed. And thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Bradley, obviously. Sorry I didn't get a chance to talk to everyone. It would have been great to meet you in person. But this has been a really great forum, and it's been really lovely for me to talk through these ideas. So thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. And we'll catch up again soon at some point.
Absolutely.